On a pitch-black Halloween night in 2003, the wind howled through the deserted streets like the whispers of lost souls. The town had long since fallen silent, with only the occasional flicker of a street lamp casting ghostly shadows on the empty road. It was the kind of night that made you feel like something was watching, lurking just beyond the edge of the darkness. A lone bus trundled down the empty street, its engine rumbling softly as the driver, a middle-aged man with tired eyes and a weary soul, focused on the road ahead. He was on the last leg of his route, eager to finish his shift and return to the safety of his home. The night had an eerie stillness, the kind that sets your nerves on edge, but he tried to shake off the feeling. After all, he'd been driving this route for years and had seen it all, or so he thought. As he rounded a bend, something caught his eye. Standing by a bus stop, illuminated by the flickering light of a nearby lamp, was a woman. She was beautiful, with long, dark hair that cascaded over her shoulders, and she wore a white dress that billowed slightly in the breeze. There was something ethereal about her, something that made her seem out of place in the modern world. The driver hesitated for a moment, wondering why anyone would be out at this hour. But then he pulled over, the bus hissing as it came to a stop. The doors creaked open and the woman glided up the steps, her movements graceful and fluid, almost as if she were floating. She didn't look at him as she passed. Her eyes were fixed straight ahead, her expression blank and emotionless. She took a seat at the very back of the bus, the seat that was always shrouded in shadows, even during the day. The driver watched her in the rearview mirror, a sense of unease creeping over him. She sat perfectly still, her gaze never wavering, her face never blinking. But then something strange happened. When he glanced back at her reflection in the mirror, she was staring directly at him, her eyes wide and unblinking, as if she were watching him with an intensity that chilled him to the bone. But when he turned his head to look at her directly, she had her back to him, her head bowed slightly, her hands resting in her lap. It was as though she existed in two places at once, one in the mirror and one in reality. The driver's heart began to pound in his chest, his breath coming in short, shallow gasps. He tried to dismiss it as a trick of the light, a figment of his imagination, but the feeling of dread continued to grow. The bus seemed to move slower, the streetlights outside casting long, distorted shadows that danced eerily across the windows. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, they reached the end of the line. The bus shuddered to a halt, and the driver opened the doors, the cool night air rushing in. But the woman didn't move. She remained seated, her back to him, as if she hadn't noticed they had stopped. He cleared his throat, his voice trembling as he called out to her, "Miss, this is the last stop. You need to get off the bus." There was no response. She didn't even stir. The driver's unease turned to frustration. He couldn't just leave her there. He had a job to do, and besides, something about her presence was gnawing at his mind, like a splinter that refused to be dislodged. He rose from his seat and made his way down the aisle, his footsteps echoing hollowly in the empty bus. The closer he got to her, the colder the air seemed to become, as though all the warmth had been sucked out of the world. When he reached her, he noticed she was trembling slightly, her shoulders shaking as though she were sobbing silently. "Miss," he said softly, trying to keep his voice steady, "are you all right?" Still, she didn't respond. Instead, she slowly lifted her hands, covering her face as if to hide from the world. "Please," the driver urged, "I need you to leave the bus. I can help you if something's wrong." For a moment, there was nothing but silence, a silence so thick and heavy that it seemed to press down on him, suffocating him. Then, in a voice that was barely a whisper, the woman spoke. "You will not like what you see," she murmured, her words dripping with a sorrow so profound that it sent a shiver down the driver's spine. Before he could react, she dropped her hands and turned to face him. What the driver saw next would haunt him for the rest of his life. Her face, once beautiful, was now a grotesque mask of decay. Patches of her skin had sloughed off, revealing the raw, skeletal structure beneath. Her eyes were hollow, sunken deep into her skull, and her mouth was twisted into a grimace of pain and despair. Flesh hung in ragged strips, barely clinging to her bones, and a sickly odor of death wafted from her. The driver stumbled back, his heart pounding wildly, a scream lodged in his throat. His mind raced, unable to comprehend the horror before him. He tried to look away, to escape the nightmarish vision, but he was rooted to the spot, paralyzed by fear. The woman, no, the creature, smiled, a terrible, twisted smile that conveyed no warmth, no humanity. "I warned you," she hissed, her voice now guttural, unnatural. And with that, the world around him began to spin, the darkness closing in, suffocating him. He felt his consciousness slipping away, his mind unraveling like a thread pulled too tight. The next morning, they found the bus parked at the end of the route, the doors wide open. The driver was lying on the ground outside, his eyes wide open, staring blankly at the sky. He was alive, but barely. His mind had been shattered by the terror he had witnessed. He spent the next 2 weeks in a coma, his body present but his mind lost in the dark recesses of his shattered psyche. When he finally awoke, he was no longer the man he had once been. His senses were dulled, his mind fractured, and he could no longer distinguish reality from nightmare. They placed him in a mental institution, where he would spend the rest of his days. And though he rarely spoke, when he did, he would tell the story of the beautiful woman who had boarded his bus on that dark Halloween night, the woman who had shown him the true face of horror. But no one believed him. They dismissed it as the ravings of a broken mind, the delusions of a man driven to madness by the darkness. Yet, on cold, moonless nights, when the wind howls through the deserted streets, some say they can still hear the sound of a bus engine rumbling in the distance, and the soft, haunting laughter of a woman echoing through the night. The wind howled through the twisted branches of the old oak trees as Halloween night in 2004 fell upon the small town. Shadows danced in the pale light of the street lamps, and the scent of damp earth mingled with the faint aroma of burning leaves. A young boy, no more than 12, stood at the edge of a darkened street, his heart pounding in his chest. His older brother and a group of older kids from school surrounded him, their sneering faces lit by the dim glow of the streetlight. "Come on, don't be a coward," his brother taunted, his voice dripping with malice. "All you have to do is go into the graveyard at midnight and place a garland on each gravestone." The boy swallowed hard, his throat dry as sand. He didn't want to do it, but the thought of being labeled a coward, of being laughed at and ridiculed by the others, was too much to bear. With a shaky breath, he nodded. "I'll do it." The group of boys exchanged glances, their smirks widening as they handed him a bundle of garlands. "Good luck," one of them sneered, as they watched him approach the graveyard. The iron gates of the cemetery loomed ahead, rusted and ancient, as though they hadn't been opened in years. They groaned in protest as he pushed them open, the sound echoing into the night like a dying man's last breath. The moonless sky above cast the cemetery into complete darkness, the only light coming from the distant flicker of the street lamp far behind him. The boy hesitated for a moment, his breath coming in shallow gasps, before he steeled himself and stepped inside. The air grew colder as he walked further into the graveyard, his footsteps muffled by the thick layer of fallen leaves. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional rustle of branches or the distant hoot of an owl. He glanced at his watch. Midnight, the witching hour, the time when the veil between the living and the dead was thinnest. Clutching the garlands in his trembling hands, the boy made his way deeper into the graveyard, his eyes darting from one shadow to another. He could barely make out the shapes of the gravestones, their edges softened by years of neglect and the creeping embrace of moss. He forced himself to move, his legs heavy with fear. As he placed the first garland on a gravestone, he felt a chill run down his spine as though the ground beneath him was exhaling a long, icy breath. He shook it off and moved to the next gravestone, his hands shaking so badly he could hardly tie the garland in place. One by one he placed the garlands, each task bringing him closer to the end, but not closer to relief. As he worked, the feeling of being watched grew stronger. It was as if unseen eyes were boring into his back, following his every move. He turned around quickly, but the darkness revealed nothing but shadows. His heart hammered in his chest, but he kept going, driven by the fear of returning to the older boys without completing his task. Finally, he placed the last garland on a gravestone and he let out a breath he didn't know he had been holding. "That's all of them," he whispered to himself, trying to steady his nerves. But as the words left his lips, a sudden bone-chilling cold enveloped him. His breath fogged the air and the cemetery seemed to grow darker, the shadows closing in around him. He froze, his body paralyzed by a primal terror he couldn't understand. And then he felt it. A cold, bony hand clamped down on his shoulder, its grip like iron. His heart stopped, his blood turning to ice in his veins. He tried to scream, but no sound came out. A voice, low and rasping, filled with malice and ancient rage, hissed in his ear. "You forgot mine." The boy's mind reeled, his eyes wide with terror as he slowly turned his head, the world around him spinning in slow motion. Standing behind him, half shrouded in shadow, was a figure, tall, gaunt, with hollow eyes that glowed faintly in the darkness. The figure's skin was pale, almost translucent, stretched tightly over its skeletal frame. It wore tattered, decaying clothes that seemed centuries old, and its mouth was twisted into a grotesque grin that revealed yellowed, broken teeth. The boy wanted to run, to scream, to do anything to escape, but his body refused to obey. The figure's grip tightened on his shoulder, its fingers digging into his flesh with an unnatural strength. "You forgot mine," the figure repeated, its voice like the sound of dry leaves rustling in the wind. In a surge of panic, the boy wrenched free from the figure's grip, stumbling backward and tripping over a gravestone. He scrambled to his feet, the garlands forgotten as he ran, his legs pumping furiously, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The cemetery seemed to stretch endlessly before him, the gates impossibly far away. Behind him, the sound of dragging footsteps echoed through the night, growing louder, closer. The boy didn't dare look back, the terror too great, too overwhelming. He burst through the cemetery gates, not stopping until he reached the street where the older boys were waiting. He collapsed to the ground, gasping for air, his body trembling uncontrollably. The older boys looked down at him, their faces twisted in confusion and disappointment. "Did you do it?" his brother asked, his voice laced with disbelief. The boy couldn't speak, couldn't even nod. He could only stare at the cemetery, where the shadows seemed to watch him, waiting, whispering. The older boys, frustrated by his silence, eventually left him there, their mocking laughter fading into the distance. But the boy knew he couldn't leave. Not yet. Not until he placed the final garland. With trembling hands, he reached into his pocket, pulling out the last garland he hadn't realized he still had. Slowly, he turned back to the cemetery, the fear gnawing at his insides. He had to go back. As he approached the gates once more, they creaked open as if waiting for him. The darkness within seemed to pulse with anticipation. With a deep breath, he stepped inside, his heart pounding with dread. The gravestone where he had met the figure loomed ahead, its surface now clearly visible in the faint light of the street lamp. The boy hesitated, his hand clutching the garland so tightly that his knuckles turned white. He approached the gravestone, his eyes wide with fear. There, engraved on the stone, was a name, worn and faded by time, but the boy could still make it out. It was the same name as his own. Terror seized him, and for a moment, he was frozen in place. But then, with a trembling hand, he placed the garland on the gravestone. As he did, the cold air seemed to lift, the shadows receding as the cemetery returned to its eerie, quiet stillness. The boy stood there, his breath coming in short, sharp gasps, before he finally turned and fled, not daring to look back. But as he ran, a whisper echoed through the night, carried on the wind. "Thank you." And though he never spoke of that night again, the boy knew he had narrowly escaped a fate worse than any fear the older boys could have imagined. One Halloween night in 2005, a chilling wind swept through the town as four teenage girls, May, Irene, Kate, and Leslie, set out for a Halloween party that was rumored to be on the outskirts of town. The night was thick with the promise of mystery, and the girls dressed in their costumes were filled with excitement as they sped down the deserted freeway. The full moon hung ominously in the sky, casting an eerie glow on the lonely road ahead. As they drove further from the familiar lights of the town, the car began to sputter and slow down, as if it were running out of gas. May, who was driving, frowned at the fuel gauge. It read full. Confused, she pulled the car to the side of the road. The engine coughed and died, leaving them in unsettling silence. The four girls exchanged uneasy glances, the joy of the evening quickly draining away. "We should check the engine," May suggested, her voice trembling slightly. Leslie, always the brave one, nodded and got out of the car with her. The cold night air bit into their skin as they approached the hood. When they lifted it, what they saw made their blood run cold. There, nestled amongst the engine parts, was a hand. A lone, severed hand, pale and lifeless, the fingers curled as if they had once held on to something or someone. The girls were so paralyzed by fear that they couldn't even muster a scream. Leslie, in a daze, reached out, as if to confirm that what she was seeing was real. But before her fingers could touch it, the hand twitched. It moved. Both girls screamed in unison, the sound cutting through the still night. Their shrieks brought Irene and Kate running out of the car only to freeze in horror at the sight before them. But their terror was not confined to the sight under the hood. Kate's eyes widened as she glanced back into the car, and with a voice strangled by fear, she cried out, "There's a man in the back seat." The others turned slowly, their hearts pounding in their chests. There, in the back seat, was a man, his face obscured by shadows, his flesh torn and mangled. One of his hands was missing. Blood dripped from his body, pooling on the floor of the car. The sight was too much to bear. The girls turned and ran, their footsteps echoing on the empty freeway as the car's headlights flickered and dimmed. But the nightmare was far from over. As they fled, they realized with growing horror that the car was following them, its engine rumbling to life, moving slowly, as if mocking their fear. It crept along, relentless, its headlights piercing the darkness, bathing the girls in a sickly yellow light. Desperate, May grabbed her cell phone and dialed her parents, her voice shaking as she tried to explain what was happening. Irene, her breath coming in short gasps, called 911, screaming for help as they ran. The road seemed endless, the darkness unyielding. The car inched closer, the faint sound of its tires on the asphalt like the whisper of death itself. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the car stopped. The girls, trembling and soaked in sweat, dared to look back. The car was silent, its headlights off, standing ominously in the middle of the road. But something was different. The windows were shattered, and inside the seats were soaked with blood. Their blood? No, it couldn't be. They were uninjured, yet their clothes were drenched in crimson. The blood wasn't theirs. Within moments, the wail of sirens filled the air, and flashing lights cut through the night. The police arrived, followed closely by May's frantic parents. The girls, now in shock, could barely speak as the officers approached the car. The scene that greeted them was beyond comprehension. The inside of the car was a blood-soaked nightmare. The man in the back seat was gone, vanished as if he had never been there. But in his place, on the driver's seat, lay a black gemstone. It was smooth, polished, and drenched in blood. None of the officers could identify it, and as they held it up, it seemed to absorb the light, its surface gleaming malevolently. The girls, shivering and disoriented, were questioned, but their story was too bizarre, too terrifying to believe. Yet the evidence was undeniable. Blood everywhere, and that mysterious, dark gemstone. The police were at a loss. and the case would go unsolved, a dark mystery that would haunt the town for years to come. Still, shaken and determined not to let fear ruin their night, the girls insisted on going to the party. But when they arrived at the address, they found only an empty, desolate lot. There was no sign of life, no sound but the wind whispering through the tall grass. Confused, they stepped out of the car, their feet crunching on the dry earth. And then they saw them. Scattered across the ground, half buried in the dirt, were more of those black gemstones. Each one glistened with blood, identical to the one found in their car. The moonlight reflected off their smooth surfaces, creating an otherworldly glow. Terrified, the girls backed away, but the pull of the gemstones was irresistible. One by one, they found themselves drawn toward the dark stones, their minds clouded with fear and fascination. What were they? Where did they come from? The questions swirled in their minds, but no answers came, only a deep, all-consuming dread. In that vacant lot, under the cold light of the moon, the girls' screams were swallowed by the night. And when the sun rose the next day, the lot was empty, save for a few scattered black gemstones glinting in the morning light. No one ever saw May, Irene, Kate, or Leslie again. The story of that Halloween night became the stuff of legend, a cautionary tale whispered among the townsfolk, a reminder of the unknown horrors that lurk in the shadows. But those who dared to venture near that lot on Halloween nights claimed to see a faint, ghostly light flickering in the distance, and some even said they heard the faint echoes of a car engine, still following, still searching, still haunted by the blood of those lost souls.